in the United States right now, and of course, different countries that have their own numbers, but there are somewhere around 70 million adults who grew up going to church but no longer do. That's a lot. And that number grows by somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million a year, maybe even a little more now. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But the point is that at any given moment, an awful lot of people who grew up Christian are wondering if that's something they want to stick with. They see it maybe doing harm to themselves. They see it doing harm to others. They wonder who gets to define what it is, because depending on who defines it, they have to decide whether they fit that definition or not. So this struggle of religious identity, it's been a struggle in my life, and I was a pastor for 24 years. So this is a book that is not trying to tell people you better stay Christian or bad things will happen to you or something like that. It's a book that's trying to help people think through that question in a morally responsible way.
Our series, Do I Stay Christian, based on the book by Brian McLaren, the author that you just saw there. And we're going to take communion at the end of the service, by the way. If you're watching online, just have a beverage and a piece of bread ready. It doesn't matter what kind you have, and participate with us. You're more than welcome to do that. Please do. And in this book, Brian is writing out of the conversations that he's had, probably literally thousands of people at this point, as he travels and speaks. And it is his attempt at helping people work through this question that so many people are asking as they see Christianity mean different things to different people. And they see what's happening in America using Christianity often. And then just the questions and doubts that thinking, compassionate people have about religion and faith and metaphysical claims. And so what Brian is doing in this book is he's trying to help us figure out how to make a decision, an informed, values-based decision about whether or not to stay Christian. Now, Brian is a follower of Jesus. He says in the book, he's not trying to convince you if you want to say no. He's not trying to convince you to say yes. And, I'm a Christian pastor, all right? So, I want to say yes. But the book is written in three parts. No. So do I stay Christian? No. Here are reasons not to. And then yes. And then if yes, then how? And the past 2 weeks, we've talked about the no sections. And if you've been in the Connect groups, you've discussed the no sections. Those can be challenging for some folks, liberating for others. Today, we're starting the yes sections. So depending on where you are in your spiritual life, you might kind of still be feeling no. You might be in a place, maybe you call it deconstruction, maybe something else, where you're just not sure. And maybe you're not quite ready to move on to yes. But in the sermons for the next 2 weeks and in the Connect groups, these are the yes sections. Now, why are we discussing this book for Lent? Lent is a season of preparation for Easter. So Easter is April 9th, the week after we move to Perry High School, and Brian is our special guest. And Lent is a time when we anticipate the death and resurrection of Jesus, and we want to prepare ourselves to follow Jesus, those who want to say yes. So what we're doing as we go through this book for Lent is we're asking, how can I deal with the no material, even if I want to say yes? How can I honestly acknowledge that? How can I be a better follower of Jesus because of that? If I want to say yes, maybe there's a path forward that I never imagined. If I'm not sure, maybe I can see that there are options that I didn't see before, that I wasn't aware of before. And that's where we're headed today. My message today is entitled, We Have Options. I love a band called Tame Impala. I don't know how many people they've been around for a few years, but they have a song that was also covered by Rihanna. And it's about relationships and maybe being in a bad relationship. And there's a line that goes, stop thinking you're the only option. And so I think for some people, they have this relationship with Christianity that is toxic. And they always kind of feel like they have one foot out or they should leave. And it's like they're in this abusive relationship. And maybe they need to say to this expression of Christianity that has been toxic, that has been violent, stop thinking you're the only option. We have options. And so that's where we're headed today on week 3. And by the way, these new Connect groups are meeting various nights of the week, and there's still a chance for you to get involved and read along. And the Connect groups will talk about these same chapters today. So today I'm covering chapters 11 through 15. And here they are. Chapter 11 of the yes section is, Brian says, because leaving Christianity hurts allies and helps their opponents. Chapter 12, because leaving defiantly or staying compliantly are not my only options. We're going to talk more about that. Chapter 13, because where else would I go? Chapter 14, because it would be a shame to leave a religion in its infancy. It's an interesting chapter if you haven't read it yet. It's kind of new food for thought probably for most folks. And chapter 15, because of our legendary founder. And so what I'm going to do is quickly highlight these chapters, and I'm going to pick up on the common thread of we have options, and another one or two of these chapters for the rest of the sermon. So over the years, I have met with people who are not sure they could stay Christian or what that would look like, who have maybe already exited church, or maybe they've come back to try this church after being out for 10 or 15 years. And a lot of times their struggle could be summarized like this. This was the question that they were trying to figure out, thinking that they only had two options. Option 1, to be true to my values, I have to leave. I see what's going on in Christianity in America. I see this ridiculousness of white Christian nationalism. I know how Christianity has been intertwined with politics and all kinds of evil throughout the history of America and the history of the world. I have questions and doubts that don't get dealt with. Just questions normal thinking people would have that I know I can't really say out loud in my church or they'll kick me to the curb. Or because of who I am, or who I love, or my orientation, or because of somebody I love and their orientation, a child or a friend or whatever. And I just can't do this. To be true to my values, I have to leave Christianity. Or they think the only other option they have is, well, I have to sell out my values in order to stay. That I know what the pastor says on Sunday morning is not what I believe. It's getting more and more radical. Some of you had moments of clarity over the past several years when maybe you were in a church where the pastor would speak out against, well, quote unquote, something going on in society, and you got the idea, I think he supports what I think is evil. Wait a second here. And so that maybe sent you off on a journey of renegotiating your relationship. There are so many people right now, I think, in churches around here, and you know, I don't view other churches as enemies. I don't want to fall into that, just being critical all the time. And around America, though, where there are a lot of people sitting in a church service right now, and they're like, I don't know that we should be here. I don't know that I should raise my kids here, if they have kids, but I don't know of anything else. And so I guess we just kind of have to pretend that we agree with everything and sell out my values in order to stay. I know this church, you know, some mega church somewhere, they don't really affirm LGBTQ folks, but we better stay. Or they don't affirm women in leadership, and they have a daughter in the kids ministry. And I don't believe that, but I have to sell out my values because I don't have any other options. I think that's where a lot of people are. They think there are only two options. Either option 1, in order to be true to my values, I have to leave. Or option 2, I have to sell out my values and just stuff it and pretend they're not real in order to stay. I think there's a third option. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me quickly highlight these chapters and just give a little bit of context, I think, for us and what they say to me. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the sermon talking about that third option. So chapter 11. This is what you'll read this week and what you'll study in your discuss in your Connect group. Because leaving hurts allies and helps their opponents. I've discovered as a pastor of a church like this that I have a lot of things in common. I share a lot of values and beliefs with people who may not necessarily call themselves Christians, but they want to make society better. They want to make progress in society. They're people of goodwill. They may be atheists. They may be agnostics. They may be a part of another religion. But I find that, and I don't know if this is true for you, do you ever feel like sometimes you have in common with like good agnostics more than you do some Christians? And so I have found that to be true, that I feel like I'm allies with lots of people of goodwill, regardless of their religious label or if they're non-religious. And I've had this realization several years ago that churches like this can actually be hubs of goodwill for people who aren't even religious people. I've had people who were working for a good cause, and they've been a part of the community, even if they wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians. Like I shared with a group of pastors in churches like this. I think we need new metrics. Like it's always the attendance and the offering. Like I've suggested maybe we need to measure like how many atheists are in your church. That's a good thing, And be like, what? And I just feel like a church like this can be a hub of goodwill. I'm sharing this because I'm proud of it, and because of what it says for you. Last year, I was invited to serve on a committee. It's a committee of 5 or 6 people that made a recommendation to the Chandler City Council to adopt a non-discrimination ordinance in Chandler. At that time, Chandler was the largest city in Arizona that did not have a non-discrimination ordinance pertaining to LGBTQ folks. You could be fired being gay in Chandler up until a few months ago. You could be kicked out of your house, be evicted if you're a renter. Up until a few months ago, there was no protection, non-discrimination ordinance. So I got invited to serve on this committee of 5 or 6 people, and we met a couple of times, we had a discussion, and we made a recommendation to the Chandler City Council to pass a non-discrimination ordinance. There were lots of other people. The Chandler Chamber of Commerce was begging the city to pass a non-discrimination ordinance. And other groups were involved. And just a few months ago, finally, the Chandler City Council passed a non-discrimination ordinance that made it illegal to discriminate against gay people in the city of Chandler. I'm proud of that. That's worth applauding for. And here's why. I wasn't invited to serve on that committee because I'm a dude named Ryan. It's because I'm the pastor of a church. It's because of us. If you're online, it's because of us that I was invited. It's not about me. It's because there was a church here. There are 250, 260,000 people in Chandler. There are like 5 or 6 people on the committee. You were one of those because you're a church and you decided that you want to love people. And so a church was a part of that committee that made that recommendation, that made history for the city of Chandler and the state of Arizona. You did that. And that's an example of, if I said, well, chuck it, I don't want to be a part of the kind of Christianity I see in America, well, then I wouldn't be a part of this. And we wouldn't be a part of things like that. I told a story before, a few years ago, this happened. It's another example. Once again, not about me. I got invited to the Arizona State Capitol to meet with leaders because of the state of Arizona's stance on LGBTQ folks. And in that meeting, it was the House of Representatives Majority Leader for the state of Arizona, John McCain's former campaign director, and me. And there's an old song from Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. And what am I doing here? I don't belong here. And it wasn't because there's a dude named Ryan. It's because of a church. It's because I was the pastor of a church and what that meant. And I got to say to the majority leader and to Wes, who was the leader with McCain, there are people who love Jesus, and they also love everybody else. And we think the future is brighter. We think there's going to be change, and we think that you can support that here in the state of Arizona. And Brian makes the point is by just chucking it and leaving, we don't have those opportunities anymore. To be hubs of goodwill. Church is powerful. Community is powerful. Way beyond what happens here on Sunday mornings. And so I appreciated that point that Brian made. We have the power to help allies. And then chapter 12, he says, because leaving defiantly and staying compliantly are not my only options. I'm going to spend more on this in the rest of the sermon. But every reform movement in history, religious or not, was led by people who didn't agree with the status quo, but they stayed so they could change it. That's how change happens. And so there are people who say, I'm not leaving, but I'm not accepting the status quo either. And that's how reform takes place, and that's the gist of chapter 12. We'll come back more to that later. Chapter 13, he says, because where else would I go? And when I read that, I thought, some of you have actually said that to me verbatim. In your spiritual journey, the questions that you've gone through, the strained relationships, the estrangement in relationships you've gone through because of your theological journey or your views on other things and all the emotional turmoil. And it's traumatic, really, is what it is for many of you who are going through that. And you have said, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to stay or go, or I don't know what I believe. And some of you have literally said to me, but where else would I go? Jesus is central to my life. Jesus is too important to me. Whether it's listening to podcasts, whether it's reading books, whether it's attending a church, like where else would I go? Like this is a part of who I am. And then chapter 14, and Brian writes this, it's an interesting chapter because he says it would be a shame to leave a religion in its infancy. I mean, I don't know too many people who have thought of that before. I tend to think of religion as kind of an old thing. And Brian makes a point in the chapter that there's this thought among, and probably especially more progressive people here in the United States, that eventually religion will become passé. That, Western Europe, and you see declining church attendance is kind of where we're headed, and society will move on past religion. And I've challenged that in the past. I don't think that's really a full picture of what's going on. But Brian makes the point in this chapter that religions evolve. And it may be that 500 years from now, what Christianity, looks like then to the majority of people would be something that is better than what it looks like to the majority of people now. And that's because of people like you staying and pushing it forward, challenging and prodding and pushing it forward. It's just an interesting chapter. If you haven't read that yet, chapter 14 is just good food for thought. And then chapter 15 is about Jesus. And Brian writes, one reason to stay is because of our legendary founder. And in my experience as a pastor, the majority of people that I talk to who go through all the things that, so many of us have gone through, we stay because of Jesus. It's because of Jesus. Jesus means too much to us. We want to have a relationship with Jesus. We want to follow Jesus. And for many, that's the main reason that we stay. And so I want to talk about Jesus and the fact that we have more than just two options. Stop thinking you're the only option. If it's a toxic experience of Christianity, I want to talk about Jesus and that we have options. So I talked about this trip recently. I reference it often, but in 2012, 2 months before Hannah and I moved here from Ohio, I had the chance to go on a trip to Israel and got to see sites, that are in Bible stories, and it was an amazing, moving experience. I highly recommend it for anybody. And the most moving part of that was probably visiting the Sea of Galilee, because the Sea of Galilee is where most of Jesus' ministry took place. It's a freshwater lake. It's a large lake. It's about 7 miles across, and Jesus' public ministry, when you read the Gospels, are set in towns around the Sea of Galilee, little fishing towns around the Sea of Galilee. He was an itinerant kind of Jewish teacher who traveled around the Sea of Galilee, and One of the sites is the Church of the Beatitudes. And of course, Catholics and Orthodox have built churches in various sites that may or may not be where biblical events took place, but they help us to at least, picture those or think about those stories. And so we stopped at the Church of the Beatitudes on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And this is looking south. So you're seeing that church there in the middle, the Church of the Beatitudes, and then there's the Sea of Galilee in the background. Not a bad place to live, am I right? I mean, at this time, I was living in Ohio, and there are lots of great things about Ohio. We may have people from Ohio joining us right now. But I grew up there, and there's some gray skies and things like in cold weather, and sometimes I would think, I'd like to live in a warmer place, in a sunnier place, but I just kind of felt guilty about that. And then I visited Israel. I'm like, what, this is where Jesus lived? Wait a second. No, I don't feel guilty anymore about wanting palm trees and beautiful, Anyway, so enough of that. But so this is where Jesus lived. And the Church of the Beatitudes marks what is thought of to be the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount. And then the way the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. Now, in reality, the Sermon on the Mount may have not been one sermon. It may not be that Jesus, gave one sermon on the Mount on this hill. It may be that the Sermon on the Mount is like Jesus' greatest hits, a compilation by Matthew and Luke of the things Jesus said on lots of beautiful hills around the Sea of Galilee. But this is a site that helps us picture that. And the Beatitudes are 8 sayings that begin with the word blessed. Blessed are those. And then Jesus offers this saying. And of course, they're famous. You could probably quote some of them, whether you think you can or not. But it's really interesting when you learn the context of the Beatitudes and the language and what's being said here, what Jesus is actually saying. So, blessed is the English translation of the Greek word makarios, and in plural, makarioi. So this starts out, makarioi, blessed ones are those who, makarioi. Now, makarios, or makarioi, can be translated as, of course, blessed. It can also be translated as happy, rich, or fortunate. And it was a word that came from Greek mythology to describe the gods. The gods are rich and powerful, so much so that they don't have to work. They can live a life of leisure. They can sit out by the pool and have people fan them with palm branches. They have people wait on them. They're privileged, rich, wealthy, happy, fortunate, hashtag blessed people. And then as the word evolved, it came to describe not just the gods, but human beings who acted like gods. The aristocrats of society, the upper class, the ruling class, the oligarchs of society, the very few, the 1%ers at the top who had most of the money, and at this time that was certainly true. It was enormous wealth and inequality in the time of Jesus. And you had this upper crust of people who could live a life of leisure. They lived off the work of everybody else. And they could sit around by the pool and be fanned by palm branches. Those were the Markorii. Those people. If we talk about Russia, Russian oligarchs, Makarioi. We talk about the top 1/10 of 1% in the United States, the ruling class, Makarioi. That's what that means. And so the values of this world are that's what it means to be blessed. That's what it means to be fortunate. That's what it means to be happy. That's what it means to live the good life, is that you're in the upper crust and you live a life of leisure and you break everybody else's back. You dominate everybody else. You use everybody else. And you get rich and powerful off of everybody else. And what Jesus does in the Beatitudes, and this just can't be overstated, is Jesus just flips that whole thing upside down and describes a system of values a way of living, a way of viewing the world that doesn't just sound good to some, but that flips society upside down. And he redefines makarioi, what it means to be blessed or fortunate. My sons, as I've mentioned, are in music lessons. Their song that they're working on right now is Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. It's an anti-war song about how the fortunate rich kids don't have to be drafted and go off to Vietnam. They can dodge if they want. And he said, I ain't no fortunate son. And so Jesus takes that value that this world puts on wealth and power, and he flips it on its head. Let's read. The Beatitudes are in Matthew 5 and Luke chapter 6. This is the version from Matthew. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to that mountainside, perhaps that one that we saw. And he sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed, fortunate, happy, rich, aristocrats are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, to do what is right by everybody, to give everybody a fair shot, for they will be filled. Blessed, rich, fortunate, privileged, happy, aristocrats are those who are merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you just read back through these, it's not that hard. I mean, this isn't the way of the world. We read these and we realize, no, the fortunate are not poor in spirit, they're rich. They don't have to worry about money. They don't have financial stress. They don't have to work. That's who's blessed in this world. And fortunate people are the ones who have an easy life. Fortunate people are the powerful. They don't have to be merciful. You don't get to the upper crust by being merciful. You get it by being ruthless and treating other people as objects. You don't. Wait. Fortunate people are not those who show mercy. They're people who get revenge. Always punch back. Always show them who's boss. They dominate their enemies. Fortunate people, rich people, aristocratic, wealthy, powerful people, they don't allow themselves to be persecuted. They persecute other people. They force other people to live according to their will. That's the way this world works. But what Jesus is describing is an alternative set of values. That the way this world works, it works if you're in that top 1%, 1%, 1/10 of 1%. It doesn't work for everybody else. Here's what really works. You are actually blessed and fortunate and rich and happy when you care about other people. And when you realize it's not just all about you. And other people deserve mercy just like you do. And you can make peace. And you can pray for people who hurt you. You don't have to be in this violent cycle all the time of an eye for an eye. You don't have to live like that. You don't have to live in this dog-eat-dog world. It doesn't have to be that way. And Jesus takes the values of this world and turns them upside down. And Matthew calls it the kingdom of heaven, and other gospels the kingdom of God. And that just means where God reigns, where God rules. It's God's leadership, where God leads. This is how we live. This is what society looks like, where God leads. By the way, this is what it would look like to be a Christian nation. For people who want that, this is what that would look like. A lot of people who say that don't seem to want that. But that's what it would look like. And so I remember being on the Mount of Beatitudes, and first of all thinking, man, this is really nice. And then secondly thinking, Jesus was a Jewish itinerant preacher who traveled around teaching and healing around these little cities, these towns around the Sea of Galilee. And then I thought about all of the ways that Christianity has been used and distorted, even in recent American history. I mean, people use Christianity to defend slavery, also used it to counter slavery. But you think about, like the governor, George Wallace, in the civil rights movement in Alabama. calling himself a Christian, and he just loves Jesus. And his famous line, segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever. And he's just a good Christian man. And all the people who use their Christianity to defend racism and now defending nationalism and violence and racism and bigotry and anti-trans hate and all the things that we're seeing and the ways that we're seeing Christianity used in politics in America. I remember being there on that Mount of Beatitudes and thinking, what does a traveling Jewish preacher 2,000 years ago around the Sea of Galilee have in common with George Wallace? And I thought to myself, the theological answer is jack squat. That's the answer. There is nothing about the teaching of Jesus that would lead somebody to believe that, to believe those things. It's so blatantly obvious. I talked a couple weeks ago about fake Christians trending on Twitter. When one of these politicians says something, they're such a great Christian, they say something horrible and nasty that is obviously counter to the values of Jesus, and you'll see people call them fake Christians. It's awesome. It's entertaining to read. There's nothing in common with this. It's the opposite of the kinds of things Jesus talks about. So like Brian says in chapter 11, leaving would hurt our allies and help people who are using Jesus in this way. Personally, for me, I don't want to surrender the beautiful, inspiring, and world-changing, value-flipping words of Jesus to religious fundamentalists and white Christian nationalists. I don't want to surrender Jesus to those folks. That's not the Jesus I know, not the Jesus I read in the Gospels. Maybe I'm just stubborn, maybe I'm just mean. I don't want those people to win. I don't want those people to distort what has meant so much to me, the central figure in my life. I feel I don't want Jesus turned into that. I can speak out and I can say something. And so I don't want to surrender Jesus. And of course, we all know how this works. Once a religion becomes popular and enough people follow it, it becomes useful to politicians. There are politicians who are good people who want to serve and make the world better. There are those who don't. And religion, contrary to how a lot of people view it, is actually a cultural unifier. It's something that unifies a lot of people. And if you want to get a lot of people to vote for you at the same time and as easily as possible, you appeal to their religious beliefs. Also, their gender, their educational attainment, their race. They're just ways that you can appeal to people to get them to vote for you. And so politicians who have nothing to do with Jesus Christ will stand up and they'll just be the most Christian politician you've ever seen in your life. And they'll just talk about Jesus and God and values. And then they do the exact opposite of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. Of course, that's how it works. And I don't want to surrender Jesus to those people. Now, there are people, going back to options, they see the loudest, most obnoxious voices claiming to be Christians, and they think they have those two options. Either I'm true to my values and I leave, or I just have to sell out my values and pretend that I agree with all this garbage in order to stay. Now, 2 months after that trip to Israel, Hannah and I moved here. And we started a church called One Church. And I met so many people who thought that the only options for them were either to be Catholic or Southern Baptist, because those are dominant expressions of Christianity in this area. And I'm not putting those expressions down. I'm not interested in that. It's just that that's where a lot of people come from. And it's easy to think that however you were raised is really the only option. And so there were people who were kind of, dumbfounded that there could be something other than those two things. And I remember giving a series early on called The Family Tree, and it was on the denominations of Christianity. We talked about Catholics and Orthodox and Anglicans and Methodists, and I gave a new version of that series here a few years ago before the pandemic. And Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists and all kinds of Pentecostals, all kinds of groups. And this was early on, and actually in the early days of One Church met here as well. If you don't know the story, I was there for 5 years, turned it over to my successor, who was Aaron, who gave the sermon last week on video. And there was a guy who met me after the service back by that door. I was facing this direction by the door, and he was getting ready to leave and facing me. And he stopped there and he said, "You are leading these people to hell." First time I'd ever met him. I'm like, "Hi, my name's Ryan." Now imagine the mentality of somebody who shows up at a church, I think his first time, and he feels like he has to say to the pastor on the way out, "You are leading these people to hell." The message that he had a hard time with was basically, you have options. His expression of Christianity that he grew up in is not the only option. And he was so angry that he needed to tell me that I was leading people to hell because it wasn't his expression of Christianity. It was just one of those experiences where I felt pity for somebody who thinks they only have one option. Maybe that's all they've ever known. But it's just not true. What's true is he was raised a certain way. His pastor went to the approved denominational seminary. He was taught what that little group believes. Everybody else is wrong. And then he preached that in his church, and that's what this guy heard growing up. I mean, that's what happened. And then there may be some other things going on that would lead him to say something like that. But that's what happened. He didn't know there were other options. And so even in modern times, we can see that there are other options, and they're right in front of our face, but we don't feel it because of the time that we live in right now and the loudest, most vocal people who seem to define what Christianity is in the media, and we know we don't want to be like them. But just for example, Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. He was a pastor of a church. Now, of course, we all know that, but I think a lot of people don't really think about what that means. He gave sermons from the Bible, and he based his leadership of the civil rights movement on his faith. It was fueled by faith. Whether it's speeches or the values that underline them, that God has created people to be equal, and we should love our neighbors. And that means that segregation is wrong, and making people second-class citizens is wrong. The civil rights movement was fueled by faith. If you take churches out of the civil rights movement, now primarily black churches, you're not going to have the same movement. They were the hubs of activity, the communities, the energizing space where the scripture and the real Jesus of the Gospels and the Spirit of God were allowed to create communities, and out of that came this movement that believes that God loves everybody and that people are created equal. It was fueled by faith. Now, you and I may have been raised in a church and we practice Christianity, but it was the opposite of what Martin Luther King Jr. defined Christianity to mean. Ted Cruz and AOC are both Catholics. So the idea that there is only one option, the idea, and this can be a revelation for some, that there is such a thing as Christianity. To have that challenged can be like, oh, what? It would be more accurate to say there are Christianities. There is no one Christianity. That's if you learn church history. You know, I went to a 4-year college. I got a seminary degree. I mean, you learn quickly. If you think that there is like one approved version of Christianity throughout history, and you're either in that or not, my friends, I don't have the words to tell you how false that is, how hilariously false that is. It would be more accurate to say there are Christianities. You could say Christianity is a wide river, or that there are many rivers or streams of Christianities throughout history. And another example I'm thankful for in my life, I was 17 years old. There was a pastor. Somehow I met this pastor who was a pastor of a church in my town, older guy, different kind of church, and he was giving away books, and I got a cardboard box of his books. It's blurry to me. I don't remember exactly how it happened. But there were authors in that box I had never read before in my conservative evangelical Pat Robertson on TV upbringing. There were books by authors like John Shelby Spong and John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. And I don't agree with everything they write, but at that time in my life, they were completely different than the version of Christianity that I knew. And I was at a time, you're kind of late teens, where you do question some things. And it was life-giving to me to read people who love God and they love the Bible and they love Jesus, but they have such a different version of Christianity than I do. And again, I wouldn't agree with everything they write, even now. But it showed me that we have options. So there are folks who unfortunately believe they either have to be true to their values and leave Christianity, or they have to sell out their values and say, there's a third option. This is just the truth. There are many other expressions of Christianity that you may thrive in. If you're like, man, I can't be this, however I grew up, or I can't be what I see in these Christian nationalist, quote unquote, politicians and leaders on TV, there are many other expressions. We don't have time. There are many other expressions of Christianity. You have options. I'll tell you a couple stories to close with. Brian writes in one of the chapters here about a conversation he had with two Catholic nuns, Sister Anne and Sister Jean. If you've read it, this is a great little section, isn't it? And Sister Anne and Sister Jean talked with Brian about their disappointment and the hopes that they had for their religious institution and how those hopes have changed over time. And those conversations with the nuns were over shots of whiskey, by the way. They poured them shots of whiskey. It's going to be a good, Catholic nuns and whiskey, and it's going to be a good conversation. And so Brian, he said it was just fascinating conversation with Sister Anne and Sister Jean, and they told him that they and their sisters were now being investigated and that there was a possibility that they could be excommunicated. Excommunicated. And Sister Anne said to Brian, I'm no spring chicken, but I'm not a tired old hen either, she said, so I don't mind a fight. She said, I can tell you this, if I'm getting kicked out, I'm not going quietly. On my way out the door, I'll raise my voice louder than I ever have before. And I don't know about you, I don't want to fight a whiskey-drinking nun like Sister Anne. She sounds pretty tough. And she made it clear to Brian, I'm going to stand up for what I believe. I'm not selling out my values. That's not an option for me. And then Brian writes this after that conversation. He left the conversation. He said, there are more than two options. I don't have to choose between staying a Christian compliantly or leaving Christianity defiantly. This is great. I can stay defiantly. Isn't that good? I can occupy Christianity with a different way of being Christian. That's not our mission statement at the Well, but it could be, probably. The Well is one of those expressions of Christianity where we stay defiantly. The Jesus I know and the Christianity that I practice is not defined by some politician who hijacks Jesus and then ignores everything Jesus ever said and did. That is not who defines my faith. That's not the person who's going to decide whether I'm a Christian or not. I'm not giving them that power. And so for me, for communities like the Well, we stay defiantly. And then last story, and we'll take communion together. I had dinner with a pastor friend this week, a guy that I really value. His name's Fred Harrell, and he was the pastor of a church called City Church in San Francisco. Now he's the pastor emeritus of that church, and he was down here for a meeting, and we like to grab dinner whenever he's down here. And whenever somebody from out of town comes in and they ask, where should we eat? My favorite restaurant in Arizona is called Casey Moore's in Tempe. Anybody know Casey Moore's? It's a little Irish pub. It's Casey Moore's Oyster House, I think is the official name. And so I always act like I have to think about it for a minute before I suggest it, but in reality, I know exactly where I want to go. So, how about Casey Moore's? And I'm just kind of nonchalant about it. And so I did that with Fred. And how about Casey Moore's, Fred? And okay. And so we met at Casey Moore's. And he started City Church in San Francisco back in the 90s as an evangelical church. That's where he was from and his tradition. And he went to convert all those San Franciscans. And that was an animating part of why he started that church. About 10 years ago or so, he went through a process where he changed his mind. He changed his mind on LGBTQ inclusion, which of course is a big deal in San Francisco. It's a big deal everywhere. He changed his mind on a lot of issues. And it was a theological journey that many of you can identify with, and he led his church to change their mind. In the process, he lost hundreds and hundreds of people. And they were in Silicon Valley, and there's wealth there and a lot of giving, and he said the financial impact of their church was just enormous. They had to cut people, they had to lay staff off. It was a traumatic experience. He took a lot of emotional hits from different people who disagreed with him. It was not easy for him. And he recently became the emeritus pastor. He's 60, and his successor is a female pastor. And he wants to help other churches like City Church and The Well to get started. And so he's trying to create an organization to help start new churches and provide coaching to pastors. And he said, well, how are you doing? How's The Well? And I said, we're moving to a larger space here in a few weeks. And he was like, you are? Oh. And then it hit me. He's a San Francisco 49ers fan. Their new quarterback is Brock Purdy, who graduated from Perry High School. And I said, dude, it's your quarterback's high school. And he's like, yes! And it meant even more. And so he talked about Brock Purdy for like 5 minutes. I'm like, Fred, settle down. It's gonna, let's go back. He's excited. And I said, The Well is growing, and we're out of space. And we're moving to Brock Purdy's high school to make more space here the week before Easter Sunday. And he just said, that is so great to hear. And then we had this awesome conversation, for another hour and a half about how much things have changed and how both of us who did go through traumatic experiences 10 years ago in the church world have a completely different view now. When we started The Well in 2018, just months before the pandemic, I didn't know if this church would work. If you remember 2018, I looked around, I don't know if there are people who want to follow Jesus and be Christians who can make a church work. Now, I don't know, and not be nationalists. I don't know. And then the pandemic happened, and then we relaunched here in July of 2021. 2 weeks from now, our last Sunday here, I'm going to show you pictures and video from early in that relaunch and compare it to what it looks like now. My view, and it's why I shared with Fred, and I'll close with this, my view has completely flipped from not being sure a church like this would work in 2018 to now. He and I had this awesome conversation about how we believe the future is bright for churches like The Well. And we're not perfect. We don't have it all figured out. And there are other churches around the country. But the future is bright. There are people like you who realize we don't have just these two options. There's a third option. And we want to follow Jesus, and we don't want to surrender Jesus to the ugliest voices who twist the words of Jesus into the opposite of what Jesus actually said in things like the Beatitudes. We want to follow the real Jesus, and we know that there is an option where we can thrive. And then we had some really good fish and chips at Casey Moore's. So I want to invite you to take communion now. If you want to be on Team Jesus, then I want to invite you to participate, wherever you are, here in person, or if you're watching online, just grab a beverage and a piece of bread. And on the night Jesus was betrayed, which we will commemorate here in just a few weeks, he shared a meal with his disciples. And he said, "This is my body broken for you. As often as you eat it, remember me." Let's eat of the bread. In the same way, he took the cup, and he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant shed for the forgiveness of sins. As often as you drink it, remember me." Let's drink from the cup. I invite you to pray with me. Oh God, as we just took communion, in eating the bread and drinking from the cup, we just dramatized what Jesus is all about. That is described physically in Easter. That he gave of himself on the cross, living out the values of the Beatitudes that are opposite of this world. Jesus said about the centurions who were nailing him to the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." They know not what they're doing. Father, forgive them. That's not the typical values of the fortunate ones, the rich, the powerful. That's the opposite. Jesus gave of himself even though it cost him. That's not the typical value of the blessed, fortunate, powerful. Jesus lived out the Beatitudes, an alternative way of living that flip the values of this world upside down. That's who Jesus is. That's the real Jesus. That's the real Jesus who was the center of this thing called Christianity originally. And God, many of us, we want to live out those values. We want to follow the real Jesus. But we don't know, some of us, if there's a way we can do that. Well, the other half of the Easter message is that the death of Jesus was not the end. As Paul writes, you would not let your Holy One see decay, and you vindicated Jesus by raising him from the dead. You said, no, this is the way we should live. These are the real values. This is how we live in my kingdom, in my leadership, in my empire, where we show mercy, and that makes you blessed and fortunate. And we pray for the people who hurt us, and even if we're poor in spirit, even if we mourn, we're not alone. Nobody's left alone. Nobody's left behind. This is the way. And that's the way for us. Even if we didn't think there was another option, maybe the resurrection for us means there can be an option resurrected for us. That a new kind of spiritual life could be resurrected for us this year. As we want to follow the real Jesus, maybe in ways that we didn't even know existed. We thank you that we have options. In Jesus' name. Everybody said,